Wipe them out, the Galactic Council ordered. The human whispered too late. The translation bead in my ear was so small that no one on that council floor had ever noticed it. I had worn it for 3 years. I had smiled through 600 diplomatic sessions with it pressed against my ear canal, listening to every word that was never meant for me. On the day they decided to end my species, I was sitting in the 3rd row of the observer gallery, holding a glass of cold water, and the bead whispered the verdict to me in plain English before the chief delegate even finished his sentence. 40 planetary cycles. That was how long they gave us. 40 cycles. Roughly 4 Earth years. Enough time to make it look natural. Reactor failures, crop collapse, atmospheric drift, a cascade of disasters that no single species would question too loudly. They had done it before. I knew that even before Delegate Heron of the Celari finished reading the motion aloud. I knew it because I had spent 3 years sitting in that gallery, listening to things no human was supposed to understand. My name is Commander Sira Voss. I was 37 years old when the Galactic Council voted to eliminate the human race, and I did not stand up, did not raise my hand, did not make a single sound. I took a slow sip of water and set the glass back on the ledge with both hands perfectly steady. The chamber was extraordinary. I will not pretend otherwise. 700 feet of curved amber crystal, ringed by 12 delegation platforms that floated at different heights like notes on a musical scale. The lighting was bioluminescent, soft and blue, coming from organisms that had lived in the ceiling for longer than human civilization had existed. It was the most beautiful room I had ever sat in. It was also the room where my species was just handed a death sentence. Delegate Heron spoke for another 4 minutes after the vote passed. The motion carried 10-2. Delegate Sewell of the Ethany voted against it, along with one other delegate whose translation I could not catch. Heron thanked the council for its clarity and its courage. He used the word courage. I filed that word away the way I filed everything away, in a part of my mind that never stopped working, never stopped counting. There were 6 other human observers in the gallery with me. They spoke no galactic standard. They were there for appearances, part of the symbolic gesture the council had made 3 years ago when they invited humanity to send delegates as a sign of openness. None of them had translation beads. None of them heard a word of what had just been decided. I looked at my colleague, Lieutenant Warren Cole, sitting 2 seats to my left. He was watching the ceiling organism's pulse with mild scientific interest. He had no idea. He would have no idea until I told him, and I was not going to tell him here. I pressed my right thumb against the inside of my left wrist. It was a small motion, a nervous gesture if anyone was watching. What it actually did was send a single compressed signal along a frequency that the council had never bothered to scan because they did not believe human technology operated on it. The signal contained 4 characters. It was a confirmation code. It meant the vote had passed. Somewhere across council space, people who had been waiting for that signal began to move. I sat in the gallery for another 30 minutes while the council moved on to other business. Trade agreements, boundary disputes, the usual rhythms of galactic bureaucracy. I listened to all of it. I took mental notes on 2 items that seemed useful. Then the session ended, the delegates rose, the bioluminescent ceiling dimmed slightly as if exhaling, and I stood with everyone else and walked out in a calm, orderly line. Warren caught up to me in the corridor, all long legs and cheerful curiosity. He was 26 and had been with the diplomatic corps for 8 months and believed very sincerely that the council was a force for good in the galaxy. I had believed the same thing once. "Anything interesting?" he asked. "Trade boundary arguments," I said. "Nothing you missed." He nodded and started talking about the ceiling organisms and whether they were sentient. I let him talk. I made the right noises. Inside, I was already somewhere else entirely, running timelines, checking sequences, calculating how many hours we had before the council's first implementation step would be filed with its enforcement division. We had a lot to do. We had, in fact, already done most of it. That is the part no one outside a very small circle understood. The council thought they were beginning something when that vote passed. They thought Directive Null 7 was the start of a process. It was not. It was the signal that an entirely different process, one they knew nothing about, had just entered its final phase. I had pressed my thumb to my wrist and sent a confirmation code. What that code unlocked was 11 years of preparation. 11 years of quiet, careful, patient work by people who had given everything they had to make sure that, when this moment came, humanity would already be 3 moves ahead. The Council had 40 cycles to end us. We had used 11 years to make sure 40 cycles was not nearly enough. The corridor outside the chamber smelled like recycled air and something faintly mineral, the way all space stations did. Warren was still talking. I was already thinking about a woman named Dr. Claire Henning, who was at that moment living among the Vreth on the far side of Council space, and about a man named Oliver Page, who was inside the Council's own financial network, and about dozens of others like them, scattered and invisible and ready. I thought about what Delegate Heron had called courage. I almost smiled. I caught it before it reached my face. The corridor cameras were council-operated. I kept my expression mild and ordinary all the way back to the human quarters, and then I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bunk and allowed myself exactly 90 seconds of the kind of fear that lives behind your sternum and makes it hard to breathe. Then I stood up, opened my mission log, and got to work. 40 cycles. They had given us 40 cycles. They had no idea what they had given us time to finish. I want to tell you about Oliver Page first, because Oliver is the kind of person who makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about what a person could quietly accomplish. He was 41 years old, originally from Bristol, and he had a habit of doing crossword puzzles on paper because he said it kept his handwriting neat. He was not physically impressive. He was average height, slightly soft around the middle. With reading glasses, he was always losing and finding again. He had an easy laugh and an extraordinary memory and the particular gift of being the sort of person that other people never quite looked at carefully enough. For 6 years, Oliver had been living inside the Galactic Council's financial network. Not metaphorically, not with occasional access. He had a verified identity, an office, a desk, colleagues who waved at him in the corridors of the Council's Economic Administration hub on Vera Station. His cover identity was that of a low-level data auditor contracted through a third-party agency that itself was contracted through 2 other agencies, the trail going cold well before it reached anything human. He reviewed reconciliation reports. He flagged minor discrepancies. He attended meetings where nothing much happened. He was, by all appearances, one of the most forgettable people in Council space. And for 6 years, very quietly, he had been reading everything. Oliver was not the one who came up with the long patience. That was a program born out of fear and foresight in roughly equal measure, conceived by a small group of people 11 years before the Council vote, when a series of intercepted signals suggested that humanity's rapid colonial expansion was beginning to make the Council nervous. The founders of the long patience looked at the math and reached a conclusion that was both logical and terrifying. The Council had eliminated inconvenient species before. They had done it carefully and slowly, and in ways that looked accidental. And humanity, expanding fast, asking too many questions, showing up in too many places at once, was the kind of species the Council had historically found inconvenient. The long patience was the answer to that conclusion. Its founding principle was simple. If the Council ever moved against humanity, humanity would need to already be so deeply embedded in Council space, so thoroughly aware of Council secrets, so irreversibly entangled in Council systems, that eliminating us would be like trying to remove a thread from a piece of fabric without unraveling the whole thing. We did not advertise this program. We did not brief the wider diplomatic corps. We selected people with exceptional patience, exceptional skill, and an exceptional ability to be boring on purpose, and we sent them out into the galaxy with long covers and longer instructions. Oliver was one of them. Claire Henning was another. There were 31 people in the network when the vote passed, scattered across 14 council worlds and 7 council stations. None of them carried weapons. None of them had military training in any traditional sense. They carried knowledge, access, and years of carefully cultivated relationships with people who had no idea those relationships were anything other than ordinary. My signal reached Oliver within 11 minutes of the vote. He was eating lunch at his desk, reviewing a shipping ledger that had a minor discrepancy in column 47. He read the confirmation code, set down his fork, and pulled up a file he had been building for 4 years. The file contained detailed records of 17 irregular financial transactions conducted through the council's discretionary fund over a period of 12 years. The transactions were not illegal by council law, exactly, but they were deeply embarrassing, and 3 of them involved the Celari delegation directly, including Delegate Heron's office. Oliver did not send the file anywhere yet. That was not the sequence. The sequence was precise and had been rehearsed in theory dozens of times. The first step was not exposure. The first step was positioning. He made 4 changes to his access permissions, small ones, the kind that would look like routine administrative updates if anyone checked, and those changes opened a pathway into a section of the network he had been preparing for 8 months. He set a timer. He finished his lunch. He waved at a colleague who passed his office door. And that evening, he filed a reconciliation report with a small embedded subroutine that no scanner was looking for, because no scanner knew it existed. By the time I was in my quarters writing mission notes, Oliver had already placed the first piece. I want to tell you about Claire Henning now, because Claire is the reason I still believe that the most powerful thing one person can do is make another person feel genuinely seen. She was a xenobiologist by training, which is why she was the obvious choice for the Vreth assignment, and also why the assignment nearly killed her spirit in the first year. The Vreth were the most physically formidable species in council space. They stood between 8 and 10 feet tall, were covered in dense layered plating that served the same function as skin, and communicated in a combination of subsonic vibration and precise body positioning that had taken Claire 14 months to learn well enough to stop accidentally insulting people. They were also, once you got past the terror of initial contact, intensely loyal, deeply community-oriented, and possessed of a long cultural memory that went back 40,000 years. They were also the species the Council most needed in order to project force. The Celari provided the diplomacy, the Council provided the legitimacy, but the Vreth provided the muscle. Directive Null 7's enforcement component depended on Vreth military cooperation. Without the Vreth, the Council could order whatever it liked and struggle to make any of it happen. Claire had spent 6 years becoming someone the Vreth trusted. She had learned their language at a level of fluency that most xenolinguists said was not possible for a human vocal and physical apparatus, which meant that Claire had spent a very uncomfortable year working with a medical team to modify her ability to produce subsonic tones. She had studied Vreth medicine and contributed genuinely useful research on Vreth cellular regeneration that the Vreth medical community had incorporated into their standard practice. She had sat with Vreth elders during their memory recitation ceremonies, the long ritual tellings of history that were the center of Vreth cultural life, and she had listened with complete attention for hours at a time. And she had noticed something. There was a gap in the history, a 30-year period, roughly 800 years ago by Earth reckoning, that the elders skipped over with careful vagueness. The Vreth cultural memory was extraordinarily detailed everywhere except this window, and whenever Claire positioned her body in the polite questioning posture and indicated she would like to hear more about that period, the elders would shift the conversation forward. She spent 2 years tracing the gap. What she found, buried in council archive records that Oliver quietly granted her access to, was that 800 years ago, the Vreth had been on the verge of establishing their own independent galactic presence. They had been expanding, forming alliances, becoming the kind of species that would have been a genuine counterbalance to council authority. And then they had experienced a catastrophic internal conflict that had set them back 3 centuries, leaving them diminished and dependent on council support to rebuild. The conflict had not been internal. It had been quietly provoked, sustained, and ultimately engineered by the council's predecessor body, using exactly the same methods that were now being deployed against humanity. The council had manufactured a Vreth civil conflict the same way they were planning to manufacture humanity's collapse, and then they had stepped in as the generous party who helped the Vreth recover, and they had been collecting on that debt ever since. The Vreth did not know this. Their cultural memory had been surgically trimmed, the gap created by council agents who had access to Vreth archival spaces 800 years ago. The elders were not hiding anything. They were telling the truth as they knew it. The truth had simply been taken from them. My signal reached Claire through a relay so layered and indirect that it arrived as a standard academic data packet flagged as a research update. She read the confirmation code embedded in the file header, looked up from her work surface, and sat quietly for a moment in the way she did when she was making a decision. Then she opened the historical file she had assembled over 2 years, checked it one final time, and prepared it for delivery. Not yet, not until the sequence called for it, but she was ready. There were 29 other people like Oliver and Claire, each with their piece, each waiting for the right moment in the sequence. The council had voted to eliminate humanity. They had no idea that for 11 years, humanity had been living in the walls of their house. There was a third person I need you to know about, though his role was different and his story is harder to tell cleanly, because it involves a cost that still sits with me when I am quiet at night. His name was Peter Aldridge. He was a communications technician, 29 years old, from a small town in New Zealand that he talked about constantly and lovingly. He had been embedded on a council relay station for 3 years when the council's internal security division began conducting a routine sweep of unusual signal patterns. The sweep was not looking for the long patient specifically. It was not looking for anything specific. It was the kind of broad, automated security review that large bureaucracies conducted to feel like they were doing their jobs. Peter's signal patterns were too clean. That was the problem. He was so careful that the absence of noise stood out as its own kind of anomaly. The sweep flagged his communications profile. A security officer reviewed it, and then things moved quickly in the wrong direction. We lost Peter 8 years before the vote. We lost another operative named Diane Ford 6 months after Peter, when the council tightened its signal screening protocols in response to whatever they thought they had found. They did not know what they had found. They did not know the long patience existed. They thought they had caught 2 low-level data thieves of unclear affiliation. Peter and Diane never told them anything. They went through every form of council interrogation and gave nothing. The council eventually concluded they had been independent actors with no larger network and released them to a detention facility on the outer rim. I know this because the long patients had eyes in that facility too. Peter and Diane were alive. They were not free, but they were alive. One of the final steps in the sequence, after the main action was complete, was their extraction. I am telling you this so you understand what the long patience actually cost. It was not a bloodless chess game. It was 11 years of people living double lives in alien space, carrying impossible secrets, taking unthinkable risks for a species that mostly did not know they were doing it. Peter had given up 8 years of his life. Diane had given up 6. They had done it for a species that would never know their names, and they had not broken, and I carried that with me every day. Back on Vera Station, 2 days after the vote, the council held a formal diplomatic reception. All observer delegations were invited. I put on the right clothes and attended with Warren and the other human observers, and I ate food I did not taste, and I made polite conversation with beings who had just ordered my species ended. Delegate Heron himself spoke to me for 4 minutes near the beverage station. He complimented humanity's passion for exploration. He said he hoped the relationship between humanity and the council would continue to deepen. I thanked him sincerely and meant none of it. The sequence was running. Oliver was in position. Claire was ready. 29 other people were waiting for their moments. And somewhere in the council's own systems, a very carefully designed subroutine was learning the network, reading permissions, and getting ready to do something that the council had never considered possible, because they had never considered that someone might have 6 years to prepare it. I went back to my quarters after the reception and checked my mission board. Everything was green. Every piece was in place. The council thought Directive Null 7 was a 40-cycle plan. It was not even going to make it to cycle 1. I sat at my desk, and I looked at the star field through the small porthole above my bunk, and I thought about all the people who were out there right now, in positions no one would ever fully know about, doing work that history might never record. I thought about Peter, in that detention facility on the outer rim. I thought about Diane. I picked up my mission log, opened a fresh page, and wrote 2 names at the top. I wrote them every time I opened a new page. It was the only memorial I could offer them while the work was still running. It was not enough. It was what I had. Outside, the galaxy continued in all its vast and complicated motion. Inside, very quietly, the sequence continued too. The first false disaster came on a Tuesday by Earth reckoning, which meant nothing to anyone in council space, but meant something to me because I had grown up marking weeks by their days, and old habits make good anchors when everything else is uncertain. Kepler's Reach was a human colony on the edge of council map space, roughly 400,000 people living in domed settlements around a planet that had marginally breathable atmosphere and excellent mineral deposits. The Council's implementation team had selected it as the first target of Directive Null 7 because it was small enough to be manageable and remote enough that its destruction would not draw immediate attention from neutral species. They planned a reactor cascade, the kind of event that looked like engineering failure and left very little that was useful to investigators. It was, by any measure, a sophisticated plan. There was one problem with it. Kepler's Reach had been evacuated 72 hours before the Council's implementation team arrived. The evacuation cover story was a seismic survey that had flagged unusual subsurface activity. The survey was fictional, generated by a human geological agency that existed entirely on paper and had been established 18 months earlier precisely for moments like this. The residents of Kepler's Reach were confused and unhappy about the disruption, but they were alive and relocated to 3 separate transit stations before the Council's remote interference system reached their reactor core. When the reactor cascade happened, the settlement was empty. The implementation team filed a successful completion report. They had no way to scan for life signs from their distance, and their sensor package was not designed to detect the difference between a populated settlement and an evacuated one. The Council recorded Kepler's Reach as eliminated. They held a brief internal acknowledgement of the operation's clean execution. On Verastation, the news reached the Human Observer delegation as a tragedy. Reactor failure, catastrophic, no survivors. We were given our notification before the public release as a diplomatic courtesy. Warren Cole sat down heavily when I told him. He was very pale. His hands gripped his knees and he looked at the floor and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he was going to be sick and left the room quickly. I sat with the news in the way you sit with a lie that you cannot correct yet. I thought about the 400,000 people who were very much alive on transit stations and had no idea their home settlement had just been officially declared destroyed. I thought about how long it would take them to figure out what had actually happened. I thought about the conversations I would eventually have to have with Warren, who deserved to know the truth and could not know it yet because the sequence was still running, and the sequence required that nothing and no one move before the right moment. It was one of the harder things I have carried. 3 days after Kepler's Reach, Delegate Sewell of the Ethany sent me a private message through the diplomatic correspondence system. It was technically addressed to the Human Observer delegation regarding the loss of the Kepler colony, a formal condolence, the kind of thing that all observer delegations received from council delegates on such occasions. but it was 12 words longer than standard protocol. The 12 extra words, arranged in a specific pattern in the third paragraph, formed a phrase in Old Ethiopian dialect that translated roughly as, "I voted no, and I would speak with you if you would speak with me." I read it 3 times. Then I ran it through 2 separate analytical checks to make sure I was reading it correctly and not imposing meaning that was not there. It was there. Delegate Sewell had voted against Directive Null 7. Delegate Sewell was reaching out to me. The question was whether that reach was genuine or whether it was a council trap designed to see whether the human delegation understood what had been decided and what was being done. I spent a full day thinking about this. I ran probability assessments in my head the way I had learned to do over years of intelligence work, weighting the variables, testing each possibility. What did the council gain if this was a trap? They would confirm that I had a translation bead and understood Galactic Standard, which was valuable intelligence but not operationally critical since the sequence was already running and the vote was already recorded. What did they lose if Sewell was genuine and I rejected the approach? They lost a potential avenue for early warning about the long patience. I decided it was not a trap. I decided this primarily because the 12 extra words were in Old Ethiopian dialect, which was not a language widely studied even by Galactic Standard scholars, and which would have been an extraordinarily complicated choice for a trap when simpler signals would have worked equally well. Whoever wrote those words wanted to be sure that only someone very specifically prepared would understand them. I replied to Sewell's message in the standard diplomatic format, formally thanking the Ethiopian delegation for their condolences. My reply was 11 words longer than standard protocol. In the 11th extra word, buried in the sentence structure, was a single Ethiopian character that meant simply, yes. 2 days later, Sewell and I had a meeting that was officially about cultural exchange programming. Sewell was not what I had expected. I had seen the delegate in the chamber and at diplomatic functions and had formed an impression of careful, controlled formality. In the small conference room, with no other delegates present and both of us aware that we were potentially making an enormous mistake, Sewell was something else entirely. Direct, almost painfully honest. The kind of honesty that costs something to produce. The Ethiopians were a long-lived species, slow to reach conclusions but extremely difficult to move once conclusions were reached. Sewell had been on the council for 60 of their years, which was the rough equivalent of 40 human years of continuous service. In that time, Sewell said, the vote on Directive Null 7 was the clearest example of something the delegate had been watching build for decades. The council was afraid. Not politically afraid, not afraid in the normal way that institutions grow cautious when their authority is challenged. Genuinely afraid at the level of species instinct of what humanity represented. We expanded too fast. We adapted too readily. We formed relationships across species lines with a naturalness that the council found unsettling, because the council's own model of interspecies relations was built on careful management of distance and hierarchy, and humanity kept casually ignoring both without seeming to notice that we were doing it. Sewell said, "You are not the first species they have voted against in this way." I said, "I know." Sewell looked at me for a moment in the way the Ethiopians did when they were recalibrating, their secondary eyelids drawing halfway closed. Then the delegate said, "How much do you know?" I told Sewell enough. Not everything. Enough to make clear that the long patience existed without giving specific details that would be dangerous to share in a room that might be monitored despite our precautions. Sewell listened with the complete, motionless attention of someone who had spent 6 decades learning to hear what was not being said as clearly as what was. When I finished, Sewell said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "Nothing yet. When the time comes, I will tell you what would help. Until then, keep your normal patterns. Vote as you would vote. Do not change anything." Sewell agreed. We talked for another 20 minutes about cultural exchange programming, because the room was almost certainly logged, And then we ended the meeting and walked out in different directions, and I went back to my quarters and sat for a very long time thinking about the particular courage it takes to vote no when everyone else votes yes. It was the same courage, I thought, that Peter Aldridge had shown for 8 years in a detention facility on the Outer Rim. I opened my mission log. I was not supposed to record details of contact with council delegates. I wrote 3 words at the top of the page: Sewell voted no. Then I closed the log and looked at the star field through my porthole and watched a supply hauler drift past on its way to the station's lower docking ring. While I sat there, Oliver Page was in his office, reviewing reconciliation reports and looking completely ordinary, and the subroutine he had embedded in the council's network 2 days earlier had now successfully mapped 73% of the financial administration system's internal structure. While I sat there, Claire Henning was sitting with Elder Merritt of the Vreth, participating in a memory recitation ceremony, and in her bag in a sealed data case was the complete historical record she had assembled over 2 years, and she was waiting, still waiting, because it was not yet time. The council issued a second implementation directive 3 days later. This one targeted a different colony, larger, further in. They expected to reach it in roughly 18 council standard days. We had already been there. The colony received a visit from an agricultural inspection team 2 weeks prior, the inspection team being 3 long patience operatives who had spent 4 days very quietly briefing the colony's infrastructure team on a new emergency protocol. The colony administration thought the protocol was a new human government safety measure. It was actually a detailed evacuation plan that could be activated with 6 hours' notice. I sent the activation code the day the council filed its second implementation directive. 2 things happened on the same day, 2 weeks into Directive Null 7. The first was that the council's second target was evacuated without incident, the cover story being a fuel supply contamination warning. The second was that Warren Cole knocked on my door at night and came in and sat across from me and said, very quietly, "Something is wrong with the way these disasters are happening." Warren was 26 and had been in the diplomatic corps for 8 months and believed very sincerely in the council. But he was also exceptionally sharp, and he had been paying close attention since Kepler's reach, and he had been running numbers in his head that were not adding up. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "Close the door." And I told him. Warren sat without moving for most of it. By the time I was done, he had the expression of someone who had set down a very heavy object and was not sure yet whether the relief of putting it down was greater than the alarm of realizing how heavy it had been. He said, "How long?" I said, 11 years. He said, "And you knew when the vote passed?" I said, "I heard it as it happened." He said, "What do we do now?" I said, "We wait for the sequence to complete." I said, "When it does, you will understand why we waited." Warren nodded slowly. He asked about Kepler's reach. I told him everyone was safe. He let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding for 2 weeks. Then he sat up straighter and asked, "What can I do?" That was Warren, 26 years old, 8 months in the Corps, and the moment he understood what was actually happening, he did not panic and he did not fold. He asked what he could do. I gave him a task. It was a small one, monitoring the council's public broadcast channels for specific phrases that would indicate the timing of their next implementation step. It was not the most critical task. It was the right task for where Warren was in all of this. But he took it seriously and he did it well. And 3 days later he flagged something in the council's public infrastructure reports that nobody had told him to look for. Something that he had noticed on his own, and his flag turned out to be accurate. Warren Cole was going to be fine. The sequence reached its midpoint on a quiet morning when I was eating breakfast and Oliver Page was filing a perfectly ordinary reconciliation report, and Claire Henning was completing a perfectly ordinary research update on Vreth cellular biology. The midpoint was the moment the subroutine finished mapping the council's financial network, and sent back a single compressed confirmation. We were ready for the next step. I set down my fork, stood up, looked at the star field through my porthole for exactly 1 second, and went to work. I need to tell you what happened in the council chamber on the morning of the 43rd day, because it is the moment the title of this account becomes clear, and because it was the strangest morning of my life. The council had called a closed session, emergency classification, restricted to member delegates and essential staff only. All observer delegations were formally excluded. The session's stated purpose was the authorization of the third and fourth phases of Directive Null 7, which would shift from fringe targets to humanity's core populated worlds, the kind of intervention that would be difficult to disguise as natural event at scale, but which the Council had apparently decided was acceptable given their belief that the first 2 phases had been successfully completed. They believed both target colonies had been destroyed. They believed this because their implementation teams had filed successful completion reports. They believed both completion reports because it had not occurred to them that humanity could have known to evacuate. They did not know about the long patience. They did not know about Oliver. They did not know about Claire. They did not know about the other 29 people who had spent between 3 and 8 years living invisible lives in council space. They did not know about the subroutine in their financial network. They did not know about the historical file that Claire was holding in a sealed data case, or about the 22 neutral species that Oliver had quietly identified as having been previously targeted by council manipulation. They did not know about the secure relay channel that had been established 3 months earlier between the human network and the government of the Vreth homeworld, a channel that the Vreth Military Command believed was an academic research exchange, and which was in fact ready to carry a very specific kind of message the moment the right moment arrived. The council closed their chamber. They activated their session encryption. They began their meeting. And every word of it broadcast live to 34 neutral species governments across the galaxy. Not because we hacked their encryption, though we could have. We had something more elegant than that. 8 months before the vote, an operative named Grace Fuller had been contracted as a technical maintenance worker responsible for routine upkeep on the chamber's bioluminescent sealing organisms. Grace had spent 4 months in that sealing maintaining organisms, doing her job impeccably, and also installing a secondary broadcast node so small and so biologically integrated that it was functionally invisible to any scan the council ran on its own chamber. The node did not interfere with any system. It simply listened, and when it received a specific activation signal, it began transmitting. I sent the activation signal 12 minutes into the council's closed session. The signal went to the node. The node began broadcasting. The broadcast was encrypted with the specific diplomatic encryption keys of 34 neutral species governments, keys that our network had legally acquired over years through normal diplomatic exchange. Each government received the session in its own secure diplomatic channel, indistinguishable from an authorized transmission. 34 governments began listening to a Galactic Council closed session in real time. What they heard was the council methodically discussing the elimination of a species in the same calm, procedural tone one might use to discuss a budget adjustment. They heard the specific methods planned. They heard the timeline. They heard, during a moment of open discussion, Delegate Heron use a phrase that, when accurately translated into 4 different galactic standard dialects, came very close to meaning that the council viewed species management as a natural extension of its governance mandate. They heard this. And then they heard something else, because I had made sure the session captured more than the current meeting. The broadcast included, in a compressed data package attached to the live feed, Oliver's complete record of the 17 irregular financial transactions. It included documentation of 6 species that had experienced suspicious catastrophic events in the past 200 years, events that council records showed had been preceded by closed session discussions, with language structurally identical to Directive Null 7. It included 300 years of council internal communications on the subject of species population management, communications that no one outside the council had ever been permitted to see. 34 governments received this while the council was still talking. The Vreth Military Command received it with an additional attachment. Claire Henning's 2 years of historical research, fully sourced, fully annotated, documenting what had been done to Vreth history 800 years ago, and how the council had engineered the conflict that had left the Vreth diminished and dependent. Claire had delivered the attachment herself. She had walked into the office of Military Commander Vedran, who had known her for 4 years as the human researcher, who had given her secondary hearing capacity to properly learn their language, and she had set the data case on the desk and stood very still while Vedran read the first section. She had then answered every question Vedran asked, clearly and directly, for 2 hours. At the end of those 2 hours, Commander Vedran stood. The Vreth stood the same way when they reached a conclusion, full extension, all plating aligned, a physical statement of settled decision. Vedran said, in Vreth subsonic that Claire translated in real time, we will be making a statement. The statement came 4 hours after the council's closed session was exposed. Commander Vedran broadcast from the Vreth homeworld, and the broadcast went to every species with a diplomatic signal receiver. It was short. It stated that the Vreth armed forces were withdrawing all cooperation from the Galactic Council, pending a complete review of council conduct toward member and associate species. It stated that the Vreth had received evidence of historical manipulation by council predecessor bodies. It stated that the Vreth were formally requesting that other species review the documentation that had been shared through secure channels. It stated that the Vreth considered the human species to be a protected associate, pending the outcome of that review. 3 other species governments issued similar statements within 6 hours. The council's closed session had lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. When it ended and the delegates walked out, they walked into a galaxy that had heard every word of what they had said in private and had already begun responding. The Celari delegation received 17 simultaneous diplomatic communications in the hour after Vedran's statement. 11 of them were from species requesting clarification on documents they had received. 3 of them were from species announcing suspension of current cooperative agreements pending review. 3 of them were from species requesting formal emergency sessions of the broader, interspecies diplomatic body that technically predated the Council, and had authority the Council had always preferred to keep theoretical. Delegate Heron was in the corridor outside the chamber when his assistant gave him the first summary. I was not there to see it. Warren was, because Warren had very quietly positioned himself in an apparently accidental spot near the council staff corridor, and he told me about it later. He said Heron stood very still for a long moment. Then the delegate asked his assistant to read the summary again. Then Heron asked 3 questions about the Vreth statement. Then Heron said nothing for approximately 90 seconds, which Warren found remarkable because Heron was not a man who ever stopped talking for 90 consecutive seconds. Then Heron walked back toward the council chambers, and Warren walked the other direction, and Warren sent me a single-word message on our internal relay that said, "Working." Yes, it was working. I was in my quarters when I received Warren's message, and I was also on a communication line with Sewell, because Sewell had reached out the moment the session exposure became public, and I had taken the call immediately. Sewell's voice carried the quality I had started to recognize as the Ethany equivalent of controlled urgency, a kind of vibratory tightening in their lower register. Sewell said, "They know the session was broadcast. They are trying to determine how. What do you need from me?" I said, "Right now, I need you to call for an emergency convening of the pre-council interspecies assembly, formally, using your standing as a senior delegate." Sewell was quiet for a moment. Then the delegate said, "That body has not been formally convened in over a century." I said, "I know." Sewell said, "They will know it was me." I said, "Yes." Another pause, then Sewell said, "Give me 40 minutes." It took 35. The Pre-Council Interspecies Assembly was technically the older and higher authority, predating the Galactic Council by 300 years, dormant for most of that time, because the Council had carefully made itself the default venue for all galactic governance. It had never been formally dissolved. It had simply been made irrelevant through the slow accumulation of Council authority. Its convening rules were still valid. Its charter was still recognized by 60% of species in Council space, including 7 who were not Council members. When Sewell filed the formal convening request, it triggered an automatic notification to every species in the recognized galactic community. The Council could not block it because they had never formally superseded it, only ignored it. The notification went out. 61 species received it. 44 of them confirmed attendance within 2 hours. The Galactic Council had not been dissolved. It had not been defeated. It had, between a closed-session broadcast and a dormant assembly convening, been made into a minority voice in a room that was suddenly full of other voices, many of them very angry, and many of them holding documentation that the Council had never expected them to have. I sat in my quarters and listened to Warren's updates and Sewell's messages and the public broadcast channels all at once, and I thought about the moment I had pressed my thumb to my wrist in the chamber gallery and sent a 4-character confirmation code. 11 years of work, 31 people in the field, Peter Aldridge in a detention facility, Diane Ford in the same facility, Grace Fuller in a ceiling, Oliver Page in an office reading reconciliation reports, Claire Henning learning subsonic language and giving 2 years of her life to a historical record that had just cracked the most important military alliance in Council space. The Council had voted to eliminate humanity. They had not eliminated anything. They had, without knowing it, ended themselves. Not in fire, not in confrontation, in documentation, in timing, and in 11 years of very patient human beings being very boring in very important places. I allowed myself another 90 seconds of feeling something enormous and unnameable. Then I opened my mission board, checked the extraction status for the detention facility on the outer rim, confirmed that the team was in position, and would move in 6 hours when the Council's enforcement capacity was fully occupied with managing the diplomatic collapse, and went back to work. Peter and Diane were coming home. There was still a great deal to do. 6 months later, I was standing in the same chamber. The bioluminescent ceiling organisms still pulsed with their slow blue light. The amber crystal walls still curved upward to that extraordinary height. The chamber still smelled of recycled air and the particular mineral quality of space stations that had been pressurized for a very long time. It looked the same, everything else was different. The floating delegation platforms had been reconfigured. There were more of them now, and they were arranged differently, no longer in the tiered formation that had always placed the 12 Council species at different heights above everyone else. Now they were arranged in a wide arc at the same level, 41 platforms, and more were being added as the weeks went on, and more species formally joined what was being called the Interspecies Compact. It was not the human name. The Vreth had proposed it, which seemed right. They had lost the most to the old arrangement. They had also moved fastest once they understood the truth, and Commander Vedran's voice had carried more weight in those first chaotic weeks than anyone else's. The compact bore some of the Vreth sensibility, which was thorough and unambiguous and did not believe in leaving important things vague. I was standing on the main floor because I did not have a platform. Humanity was not leading the compact. We had made that clear from the beginning, in every meeting and every negotiation and every conversation where someone suggested that we should, given what we had done and what we knew. We said no every time, and we meant it every time. And after a while people stopped suggesting it with surprise and started expecting it, which was perhaps the more important outcome. The Compact Charter was in the process of being ratified. It had taken 4 months to write, and it had been written by 11 species together, with human input at a working level but no human holding the lead pen. Sewell had chaired the drafting committee, which seemed right to me. Sewell had voted no in a room where voting no cost something real. That kind of clarity deserved a role in building what came next. I had contributed one thing to the charter, outside the normal drafting process. I had made a single request, delivered to Sewell in writing, which Sewell had brought to the full drafting committee without stating where it came from. The request was that the preamble of the compact charter include, by name, every person who had died or been detained in service of the Long Patience Program. There were two people who had died. Their names were Peter Aldridge and Diane Ford. Peter and Diane had been extracted from the Outer Rim Detention Facility 9 days after the Council session exposure, while the Council's enforcement capacity was occupied with 100 other crises simultaneously. The extraction team was 3 Long Patience operatives who had prepared the operation for 4 months and executed it in 40 minutes. Peter and Diane were brought to a human transit station and given full medical evaluation, and then, because neither of them asked to be kept in any kind of operational capacity, given tickets home. Peter went back to Bristol. He called me once, 3 months later, from what sounded like a very ordinary kitchen. He said he was learning to bake bread because it turned out that after 8 years of being someone else, making something simple with your hands was what he needed. He said his crossword puzzles were still on paper. He asked how things were going. I told him they were going well. He said good, and sounded like he meant it, and that was the last time we talked before the compact ratification, though I expected it would not be the last time we talked ever. Diane went back to her family in Edinburgh. She did not call. I sent her a message on the day the charter was signed, and she replied with 2 words, "About time." I took that as a reasonable assessment of the situation. The 2 people who had died were not operatives. They were residents of Kepler's Reach who had not been in the settlement during the evacuation because they were on a personal trip to another colony and their transit record had not been flagged in time. They came back to find their home declared destroyed and their official status listed as casualties of a reactor failure. They were alive, physically unhurt, but they had gone through several months of bureaucratic limbo in which they officially did not exist before the Long Patience Network was able to regularize their situation through channels that could not yet be explained publicly. I am telling you this with care because I want to be accurate about what the Long Patience cost. It cost 8 years of Peter's life and 6 of Diane's, and it cost those 2 people months of a particular kind of disorientation that does not have an easy name. It cost the 31 operatives the particular weight of carrying secrets of that magnitude for years. It cost me things I am still in the process of identifying. It did not cost anyone their life, which was not luck. It was the result of being extraordinarily careful for 11 years in ways that exhausted everyone involved. I stood on the compact chamber floor and watched Sewell sign the charter. The Ethany used a physical writing instrument, a choice Sewell had made deliberately because the pre-council assembly had always ratified documents with physical signature, and this was the pre-council assembly's child, in spirit if not in name, and some continuities were worth preserving. The pen Sewell used was Ethany made, long and slightly iridescent, and it moved across the charter surface with a sound like a very quiet bell. 40 other representatives signed after Sewell. I watched all of it. When the last signature was complete, the chamber did something it had apparently not done in over 300 years. Someone played an old Ethany recognition tone, the one that had traditionally marked the opening of a new governance era. It was a long, low sound, partly subsonic, the kind of tone that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears, and it lasted for about 30 seconds, and by the end of it, several delegates were very still in the particular way that beings get still when they are feeling something they cannot yet name. Warren Cole was beside me. He was crying, which he was slightly embarrassed about and which I thought was completely appropriate. He had spent 6 months learning Galactic Standard at a pace that had impressed even our language training team, and he now understood roughly 40% of what was said around him without a translation bead. He was going to be extraordinary at this work. I had already recommended him for a role in the Compact's new diplomatic liaison structure. He said quietly, "They actually did it." I said, "We actually did it." He looked at me, he said, "That is a big we." I said, "That is the only kind of we that matters." The Compact Charter's preamble, read aloud by Sewell at the opening of the ratification ceremony, contained 22 paragraphs. The 22nd paragraph was the one that had come from my request, and Sewell read it with the same steady, formal attention given to every other paragraph. No special emphasis, no extra weight, just the words in their place in the document. It named Peter Aldridge and Diane Ford. It named the 2 Kepler's Reach residents. It named the 31 operatives, every one of them. It said that the compact existed in partial recognition of the work done by people whose names would not otherwise be in any public record, and that the compact would endeavor to be worthy of that work. I did not cry. I had cried exactly once since the council vote, alone in my quarters very late on the night of the extraction, when I confirmed that Peter and Diane were safely aboard the transit vessel and heading toward human space. I had cried for about 4 minutes, very quietly, and then I had cleaned my face and gone back to work. That was what the work required, and I had given the work what it required for 11 years, and I did not regret a day of it, though I would not recommend the experience to anyone who had a choice in the matter. After the ratification, there was a reception. These things always ended in receptions. It was apparently a galactic universal. Beings who had just done something significant together needed to stand around with food and drinks and process it in small group conversation rather than alone, which struck me as a sound instinct. Delegate Harron was not at the reception. The Cellari had not joined the compact. They were in a complex period of internal review, driven partly by the financial documentation Oliver had provided and partly by the testimony of several species who had come forward with experiences they had previously been afraid to report. The Cellari were not the only species in that position. The Council's 12 founding species were in various states of reckoning with what had been documented about their collective conduct, and the Compact had made a deliberate decision not to exclude any of them in principle while requiring accountability in practice. Sewell was at the reception, the Ethany delegate who had voted no, who had sent 12 extra words in a condolence message, who had convened a dormant assembly with 35 minutes of preparation time, and not flinched when it became clear what that would cost politically. Sewell found me about 20 minutes into the reception and stood beside me in the Ethany way, close enough to indicate alliance, far enough to indicate respect. Sewell said, "You knew before you replied to my message." I said, "I had a strong probability assessment." Sewell said, "You also knew I could be a trap." I said, "Yes." Sewell said, "What made you decide?" I thought about how to answer. Then I said, "You used old Ethany dialect. It was specific to the point of unnecessary complexity for a trap. Someone running a trap would have used something simpler. You chose the harder, more precise thing because you wanted to be understood only by someone who was actually listening. I decided that anyone who wanted to be understood that carefully was probably telling the truth." Sewell was quiet for a moment with the secondary eyelids at half extension. Then the delegate said, "That is a very human way to reach a conclusion." I said, "I know, it does not always work." Sewell said, "It worked this time." I said, "It worked this time." We stood together for a while and watched the Compact's 41 founding representatives navigate the reception with the careful energy of beings who were still figuring out how to be in the same room without a hierarchy to navigate by. It was slightly chaotic. It was also the most functional chaos I had seen in 6 years on Vera Station, because it was the chaos of genuine uncertainty rather than the performed uncertainty of an institution that had already decided everything and was simply managing the appearance of deliberation. A council emissary came to find me near the end of the reception, not Harron, a younger delegate from the lesser Cellari administrative body, someone who had not been on the council when the vote passed, but who was now involved in the Cellari's internal review process. He was polite and slightly nervous, and he asked if I had a few minutes, and I said yes. He asked me when humanity had known, how long we had been preparing. I told him the truth, the full 11 years, the long patience, the founding principle. I told him about Oliver and Claire and Grace and Peter and Diane. I did not tell him every operational detail, but I told him the shape of it, the scale, the cost. He listened with the careful attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand rather than looking for something to use. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Did you always believe it would work?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "No. We believed that if it came to this moment, we would have a better chance than if we had done nothing. That was the founding principle of the long patience, not certainty, just better odds." He said, "You risked everything on better odds." I said, "We risked everything on 11 years of work that made the odds better every year. There is a difference." He nodded slowly. Then he asked, "What does humanity want from the compact?" I said, "The same thing everyone who signed that charter wants. A structure that cannot be dominated by any single species. A process for resolving conflicts that does not depend on whoever has the most enforcement capacity. A guarantee that what was done to the Vreth 800 years ago and what was planned for us cannot be done to anyone again." He said, "That is a very ambitious want." I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you think the compact can deliver it?" I said, "Not without constant work and constant honesty and people being willing to vote no in a room where everyone else is voting yes. But that is true of every governance structure that has ever functioned. The compact is not magic. It is a framework. What happens inside the framework depends on the people operating it." He thought about this. Then he said, "I will relay that to the review committee." I said, "Please do." He thanked me and left, and I stood alone for a moment in the beautiful amber crystal room with its bioluminescent ceiling and its new arrangement of equal platforms. And I thought about the night 6 months ago when I had pressed my thumb to my wrist and sent a 4-character code into the dark. I thought about all the people who had been waiting for that code. All the work that had been running while I sat in diplomatic receptions and ate food I did not taste and made polite conversation with beings who did not know what was already in motion. I thought about what Delegate Heron had called courage. I thought I understood better now what the word meant and what it did not mean. Courage was not the large moment. It was the 6-year decision to stay in an office reading reconciliation reports when every instinct said to run. It was the 2-year decision to sit with Vreth elders in ceremonies that lasted 8 hours and learn their language well enough to hear what was missing from it. It was the 35 minutes Sewell took to file a convening request for an assembly that had not met in a century. Courage was, mostly, the decision to keep going when the outcome was uncertain and the cost was real. That night I went back to my quarters. The portable desk I had been using for 6 years was still there, battered at the corners, covered with scratches from a dozen different stations and transport vessels. I sat down at it and opened a new document. I wrote the word preamble at the top. Then I stopped, because the preamble was done, the charter was signed, and what I was actually opening was the first page of something else entirely, something that was not a mission log and not a report and was not, I decided, going to be classified. It was this, what you are reading right now. I started it the night the compact was ratified, because I thought someone should write down what it actually looked like from the inside. The real version. The one with Oliver's crossword puzzles and Claire's modified hearing and Peter's bread, and Warren crying at a ceremony, and Sewell's iridescent pen, and the 90 seconds of breathing I allowed myself in hotel rooms when the weight of it became briefly too large to carry quietly. I did not write it for history, or not only for history. I wrote it because 2 names are in the Compact Charter's preamble, and the preamble is a formal document in formal language, and Peter Aldridge and Diane Ford are real people who deserve more than formal language. They deserve someone saying plainly that what they did was extraordinary, and that they did it without recognition, and that the galaxy they came back to was different because of them in ways they would probably never fully know. So, the Galactic Council ordered us wiped out. They gave us 40 cycles to disappear quietly. They had no idea that for 11 years we had been learning the walls of their house, and that the moment that order was given, it was already too late. Not because we were stronger, not because we were faster or better armed or more numerous. Because we had been paying attention the whole time. Because patience is not the same as passivity. Because humans, when they are afraid and when they are smart about being afraid, do not panic. They plan, they recruit, they maintain, they wait. And when the moment comes, they do not shout. They whisper. And the galaxy listens.